The order was read aloud at the morning assembly, which made it worse. Mrs. Selwick stood at the head of the long kitchen table, her spine a column of iron beneath her black bombazine dress, and read from a sheet of cream-colored paper in the clipped, bloodless voice she reserved for pronouncements of consequence. The staff of Dunhallow Hall stood in 2 rigid rows along the flagstone walls, their hands clasped, their eyes forward. No one moved. No one breathed loudly in Mrs. Selwick's presence. Most of the new regulations were routine. A revised schedule for the airing of bed linens. A reminder that candle stubs were to be collected, not discarded. An adjustment to the rotation of the kitchen fires. The staff listened with the practiced patience of people long accustomed to being governed. Then Mrs. Selwick paused. It was a deliberate pause, theatrical in its precision. She lifted her gaze from the paper and let it travel slowly down the rows of servants before she continued. By order of His Grace the Duke of Dunhallow, the East Paddock and the adjoining stable block are henceforth restricted. No member of the household staff, without exception, is to approach, handle, feed, or otherwise engage with the black stallion. The animal is under the sole authority of Mr. Coates, the head groom. Any servant found in violation of this directive will be dismissed without notice and without character reference. She folded the paper with the care of someone sealing a verdict and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Her thin lips pressed together in a line that was not quite a smile but carried all the satisfaction of one. That will be all. The rows dissolved, the staff moved toward their morning duties with the quiet shuffle of routine. But as they passed Nell, their eyes told a different story. Some glanced sidelong with pity, others looked away too quickly. Agnes, the youngest scullery maid, stared openly, her mouth a small circle of alarm. They all knew who the order was, for it was not for Thomas, who would sooner walk into the sea than approach a horse of that size. It was not for the cook's boy, who had once fainted at the sound of the stallion's hooves striking its stall door. It was for Nell, the quiet one, the one the beast had chosen. The stallion's name was Sovereign. He was a creature that seemed forged rather than born, 17 hands of dense, rolling muscle, beneath a coat so black it swallowed light. His mane hung in coarse tangles like a war banner left too long in the rain, and his eyes, deep-set and dark as peat water, held an intelligence that most people mistook for malice. He was a destrier, bred for battle, trained by a cavalry officer, and loved by only one man in the world. That man was Lord Leander Aldermere, the Duke's younger brother. And Leander was dead. He had drowned 8 months earlier. A sailing accident off the headland, they called it, though the whispers in the servants' hall used darker words. Reckless, deliberate, a grief unto himself. Leander had been the son of Dunhallow, the laughing counterpart to his brother's granite severity, and when the sea took him, it took the last warmth from the house. Sovereign had been on the cliff-top that day. The groom spoke of it in low, uneasy voices. The horse had stood at the edge, watching the water, and had refused to move for 6 hours. When they finally led him back to the stable, something in the animal had gone out, like a lamp extinguished in a sealed room. He stopped eating for days. He kicked through the wall of his stall. He bit the farrier so badly the man lost the use of 2 fingers. The head groom, Coates, a man who had gentled horses for 40 years, could manage him only with extreme caution and a healthy measure of fear. Sovereign was no longer a horse. He was a monument to ruin, pacing the East Paddock like a black flame with nowhere to burn. And then he found Nell. She had not sought him out. She would not have dared. Her duties kept her to the house, the upper corridors and drawing rooms that smelled of beeswax and cold stone. But Dunhallow's east corridor had a row of narrow windows that overlooked the paddock, and she passed them every morning carrying fresh linens to the guest chambers. The first time, she had simply paused. Not to admire the horse, not out of sentiment, but because the sound had stopped her, a low, rhythmic thudding. She had looked down, and seen him standing at the paddock fence directly below her window, his massive head raised, his nostrils flaring. He was striking the lowest rail with his foreleg, not violently, but with a strange, insistent patience, and he was looking up. At her she had stood very still, the linens pressed against her chest, 1 breath, 2, 3. The horse had gone quiet. His ears, which the groom said were perpetually flattened in warning, had come forward. He watched her with an expression she could only describe as recognition, though she knew that was foolish, an invention of her own loneliness projected onto an animal who could not possibly know her. She had moved on. She had not spoken of it, but the next morning he was there again, and the morning after that. Each day, precisely when she passed, he would come to the fence and stand beneath her window, his dark gaze lifted, his great body still. The grooms noticed, then the kitchen staff, then Mrs. Selwick. Within a fortnight, the whispers had become a current that ran beneath every conversation in the house. The stallion, the one that had badly injured the farrier, the one that screamed and kicked when anyone came near, would stand like a church statue beneath a window because a housemaid was walking past. It was uncanny. It was unsettling. It was to Mrs. Selwick intolerable. "You have been provoking the animal," the housekeeper had said to Nell 3 days before the assembly, her voice low and sharp as a blade drawn across glass. "You have been feeding it or calling to it. Do not deny it." "I have done nothing, Mrs. Selwick," Nell had replied, her tone level, her eyes lowered. "I walk past the window, that is all. Then walk a different route. The east corridor is the only passage to the guest chambers, Mrs. Selwick." The housekeeper's eyes had narrowed to dark slits. She was not accustomed to being answered with logic. She was accustomed to being answered with submission and fear. This girl offered neither, and it enraged her in a way she could not quite name. "You think yourself clever," Mrs. Selwick had whispered. "Clever girls do not last long in this house, and now the assembly, the public decree, a rule, shaped like a fist, aimed at a single target with the full weight of the Duke's authority behind it." Nell understood the message perfectly. She was not merely being warned. She was being told that the walls were closing in and there was nowhere safe left to stand. She picked up her bucket and her brushes and walked toward the scullery, her face betraying nothing. But beneath the starched gray of her uniform, her heart was a drum beating out a rhythm that only she could hear. And it was not the rhythm of fear. It was the rhythm of someone running out of time. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Elowyn Thorne, and she had come to Dunhallow Hall not for a maid's wages, not for shelter, and not for the dubious privilege of scrubbing another family's floors. She had come for what was hers. Her father, Callum Thorne, had been a man of extraordinary gifts, a composer and musicologist of rare distinction. He had spent the better part of his career studying the lost musical traditions of the English countryside, transcribing folk melodies that existed nowhere but in the memories of aging shepherds and fishermen's wives. His published volumes were treasured by scholars across Europe. His unpublished manuscripts, a life's work of original compositions interwoven with his research, were worth a fortune. He had also been a friend, a close, trusted friend of the old Duke of Dunhallow, Soren's father, who had invited Callum to Dunhallow Hall on numerous occasions to catalogue and restore the estate's private collection of rare musical scores, some dating back to the Tudor court. Callum had loved the work and loved the house. He had spoken of Dunhallow to his daughter the way other men spoke of cathedrals, with reverence and quiet awe. When Callum died 2 years ago, he left Elowyn everything. Cottage called Larkspur Hollow in the hills of Somerset, a modest sum in savings, and his manuscripts, the crown of his legacy, valued by those who understood such things at several £1,000s. She never received any of it. A man named Selwick, a distant relation through her mother's family, had appeared within days of the funeral carrying a revised will. It was a masterful forgery. convincing enough to satisfy a solicitor who had been quietly replaced with one of Selwick's choosing. The new will left everything, the cottage, the savings, the manuscripts, to Selwick himself, citing Eloan's youth and supposed instability as justification. She had been 19. She had been grieving. She had been utterly alone. Selwick sold the manuscripts to a private collector before the ink on the probate was dry. He claimed the cottage. He gave Eloan £4 and a cold instruction to find employment and cause no disturbance. And the woman who had just read her fate, aloud in the kitchen of Dunhallow Hall, the woman who polished her cruelty like silver and wielded her authority like a lash, was that man's sister, Mrs. Purya. Selwick had come to Dunhallow 15 years ago, long before her brother's crime, but the blood between them was a chain, and Eloan had followed it here, because a year into her destitution, a letter had found her from a former colleague of her father's, an old music professor in Edinburgh who had heard of her plight. He remembered Callum speaking, in the months before his death, of a precaution he was taking. He had been entrusting certain documents to the old Duke of Dunhallow for safekeeping, originals that could not be forged, proof that could not be denied. The professor did not know the specifics, only that Callum had feared for his daughter's future and had hidden the evidence where his enemies could not reach it. Somewhere inside this great, cold, grieving house, her future was waiting, and every day she spent scrubbing its floors brought her no closer to finding it. Mrs. Selwick had not always been cruel. Or perhaps she had, and the cruelty had simply lacked a target worthy of its full force. She had served Dunhallow for 15 years, with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. Every linen folded to the same precise dimensions. Every corridor swept at the same hour, every servant measured against a standard. So exacting, it left no room for individuality, let alone warmth. The old Duke had valued her for it. His son, Soren, had inherited her along with the title and the grief and the empty rooms, and he had never thought to question her methods. She was a fixed point in a collapsing world, and fixed points were what he needed. But Eloan knew a different Mrs. Selwick. She knew the woman behind the starched uniform and the rigid schedules. She knew the careful letters that arrived from Somerset every month, addressed in a hand that Eloan recognized with a cold certainty, the hand of the man who had dismantled her life. She had seen Mrs. Selwick read those letters in the privacy of the housekeeper's parlor, her thin mouth curving into a rare expression of satisfaction, the look of someone receiving a favorable report from a shared enterprise, because that is what it was, an enterprise. Eloan had understood this with a clarity that had sharpened over 2 years of destitution. The forged will, the compliant solicitor, the swift liquidation of Callum Thorne's manuscripts, none of it had been the work of an impulsive man. It had been planned, and the planning required a network, a sister positioned in a great house, a solicitor willing to bend, a buyer waiting in the wings. Mrs. Selwick had not merely benefited from her brother's crime, she had facilitated it. Eloan was certain of this, though she could prove nothing, and so she lived each day under the authority of the woman who had helped destroy her, ate the food that woman portioned, slept in the room that woman assigned, and performed the tasks that woman dictated, all while holding her silence like a stone held underwater. The pressure was constant, invisible, and immense. Mrs. Selwick, for her part, seemed to sense something in Nell that she could not identify but instinctively despised. It was not the horse. The horse was merely a convenient grievance, a visible infraction to be weaponized. The true offense was subtler. It was Nell's composure, the way she absorbed every slight without flinching, the way she completed even the most degrading tasks with a quiet thoroughness that refused to be diminished. Mrs. Selwick recognized this quality. She had built her entire career on a lesser version of it, and she could not tolerate its presence in someone she was supposed to control. The campaign had begun long before the assembly. Nell was assigned the heaviest work, the coldest rooms, the earliest mornings. Her meals were served last, her candle allotment halved. She was never praised and frequently corrected, often for infractions so minor they existed only in the housekeeper's imagination. It was the slow, methodical work of erasure, a campaign designed not to punish but to exhaust, to grind down the quiet composure until the girl either broke or departed. Eloan endured it all. She had no choice. The documents her father had hidden were somewhere in this house, and every day she remained was another day she might find them. Every day she left was a day she surrendered her last hope. But the walls were closing in, and the woman holding the keys was the one person in the world who had the most reason to ensure that Eloan Thorne never found what she was looking for. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 days after the assembly. Nell had been sent to beat the rugs from the east drawing room, a task that required her to carry them through the service door and across the gravel yard to the beating frames near the kitchen garden. The route took her past the edge of the east paddock. She had tried to walk quickly, her head down, the heavy rug draped over her shoulder like a penance. She did not look toward the fence. She did not slow her step. She fixed her eyes on the gravel beneath her boots and counted her breaths the way she had learned to do when the world became too much. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, a rhythm of survival. But Sovereign had heard her. The sound reached her first, the heavy percussion of hooves on packed earth, accelerating from a walk to a canter to something close to fury. The ground seemed to vibrate with it. She heard the grooms shout, heard Coates bark a warning, heard the sharp crack of a lead rope snapping taut, and then the deeper, more alarming sound of wood splintering. She stopped. She could not help it. She turned. Sovereign had come to the paddock fence at full speed and struck it with his chest. The top rail, 4 inches of solid oak, had cracked but held. The horse stood pressed against it, his neck stretched over the broken timber, his nostrils wide and rimmed with white. He was not raging. He was not violent. He was reaching. His great dark head extended toward her, his ears forward, his breath coming in long, shuddering gusts that fogged the autumn air. The grooms hung back, shouting at each other but unwilling to approach. Coates stood 20 yards away, his face the color of old chalk. Nell set down the rug. She stood in the gravel yard 6 feet from the fence and looked at the animal. His eyes were fixed on hers. She saw in them something she had seen in her own reflection during the worst months of her destitution. A bottomless, bewildered grief, the kind that does not understand why the world has changed and cannot accept that it will not change back. Her hand rose. She did not decide to raise it. Her body simply moved toward the only other living thing in this place that understood what it meant to have lost everything. Her fingers trembled in the cold air, reaching for the broad, warm space between his ears. She stopped herself. The housekeeper's words, sharp and precise as surgical instruments, cut through the moment. Immediate dismissal. Without character reference, she would be cast out with nothing. Again she would lose her only chance at the truth. Again she would be erased. Again, she lowered her hand. She picked up the rug. She turned her back on the animal and walked away. Behind her, Sovereign let out a sound. It was not a whinny and not a scream. It was something in between, a long, broken note that rose from the animal's chest and carried across the gravel yard and the kitchen garden and the stable block and up to the tall windows of the west wing, where a man stood watching with his hands locked behind his back and a feeling in his chest that he could not name. Soren Aldermere, the 9th Duke of Dunhallow, had seen the entire thing. He had seen the girl stop. He had seen the horse reach for her. He had seen her hand rise and then, with a visible act of will that seemed to cost her something physical, fall back to her side. He had seen her walk away. And he had seen the one thing that no one else in his household seemed capable of noticing. She had not been afraid. Not for a single moment. She had been obedient, and obedience without fear was something else entirely. It was sacrifice. Soren did not think about the girl for the rest of that afternoon. He was a man of discipline, of compartmentalization, and he had ledgers to review, a tenant dispute to arbitrate, and a letter from his solicitor in London concerning the declining revenues of the estate's northern holdings. He sat at his desk in the study, a room of dark oak and heavy curtains that smelled of ink and cold pipe smoke, and he worked with the grim, methodical focus that had become his only reliable method of holding the world at bay. But the image returned. It surfaced between columns of figures like a stone breaking through still water, the girl's hand rising, the horse's outstretched neck. The moment of almost, and then the withdrawal, controlled, deliberate, agonizing. He pushed it aside. He returned to the figures. The northern rents were falling. 2 tenants had petitioned for a reduction. The coal survey was overdue. These were real problems with numbers and solutions, and none of the unsettling ambiguity of a housemaid and a horse. The figures blurred. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers to the bridge of his nose. The truth was that the incident with the stallion was not an isolated curiosity. It was the latest in a series of small, quiet observations that had been accumulating in the back of his mind like sediment in a slow river, unnoticed until the water began to change color. He had first become aware of the girl 2 months ago, not as a person but as an absence of noise. In a household that hummed with the constant small sounds of labor, footsteps, the clink of china, the murmur of gossip, she moved through the rooms like something lighter than air. She was so silent, so efficient, so utterly without the nervous energy that most of the younger maids carried, that he had begun to notice her precisely because there was nothing to notice. She did not drop things. She did not whisper to other servants when she thought he could not hear. She did not look at him with the mixture of awe and terror that he had come to expect from his staff. She simply worked, and her work was immaculate. He had mentioned it once, a throwaway comment to Mrs. Selwick during a household review. The new girl, Nell, she seems competent. The housekeeper's reaction had been immediate and disproportionate, a tightening of the mouth, a glint of something hard and watchful in her dark eyes. She is adequate, Your Grace, nothing more. I would not single her out. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Now replaying the moment, he recognized the response for what it was, not a professional assessment, a warning. He rose from his desk and walked to the window. The paddock was visible from here, a distant rectangle of green framed by stone walls. He could see the broken rail, a pale scar in the fence line where Sovereign had struck it. The horse was standing in the far corner now, his head lowered, his tail still. He looked diminished, as though the effort of reaching for the girl and being denied had taken something from him that he could not recover. Soren knew that feeling. He had felt it every day since Leander's funeral. The exhaustion of reaching for something that was no longer there. He returned to his desk. He did not pick up his pen. Instead, he sat in the gathering dusk and allowed himself to think about his brother, something he rarely permitted. Leander, who had laughed too loudly and loved too fiercely and ridden too fast. Leander, who had brought Sovereign home as a half-wild colt and gentled him with nothing but patience and sugar cubes and a singing voice that could calm a storm. "He knows who's real, Soren," Leander had said once, rubbing the stallion's nose in the stable yard, his eyes bright with that infuriating infectious joy. "Animals always do. They don't care about your title or your money. They care about what's underneath." Soren had dismissed it as sentimentality. Leander had been full of sentimentality. It was his greatest charm and his most dangerous flaw. A heart so open, it could not protect itself from anything. And now the horse, Leander's horse, the last living vessel of his brother's spirit, had chosen a girl. A servant girl who cleaned fireplaces and scrubbed floors and refused to reach out her hand even when every line of her body was drawn toward the animal like iron to a lodestone. Why? The question would not leave him. It sat in his chest like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. His mother arrived the following Friday, unannounced, as was her custom. Lady Jessamine Aldermere was not a woman who believed in the courtesy of warning. She believed that people revealed their truest selves when they were unprepared, and she had built a lifetime of sharp judgments on the evidence gathered in those first unguarded seconds. She swept into Dunhallow Hall in a traveling cloak of deep burgundy, her silver hair pinned beneath a hat that was at least a decade out of fashion and twice as elegant for it, and she surveyed the great hall with the critical eye of a general inspecting a garrison. "The house is cold," she announced to no one in particular, "and it smells of damp. Has no one thought to light the fires in the west wing? I may be old, Soren, but I am not yet prepared to be frozen to death in my own family's home." Soren, who had been summoned from the study by a breathless footman, met her in the hall with the expression of a man who has just been informed that a siege has begun. "Mother, you did not write. I did not. Letters give people time to tidy up, and I wanted to see the mess." She kissed his cheek with brisk efficiency, and then held him at arm's length, studying his face. "You look dreadful. When did you last eat a proper meal? Or sleep? You have the complexion of a man who has been arguing with his own ghost." "I am well. You are lying, but we shall address that later. First, tea. And not the bitter swill Mrs. Selwick calls tea. I brought my own from London." They sat in the drawing room, a fire hastily lit by a flustered housemaid, and for a time spoke of small things: the road from York, the state of the bridge at Kelston, the price of wool. Lady Jessamine was skilled at the art of approach, circling her true subject with the patience of a hawk riding a thermal. Then Nell entered with a fresh tray of hot water. She curtsied, set the tray on the side table with precise noiseless movements, and turned to leave. "Wait," Lady Jessamine said. Her voice was not sharp, but it carried a quality that made waiting the only possible response. "You are new." "I have been at Dunhallow for 4 months, Your Grace. 4 months. And your name, Nell, Your Grace?" Lady Jessamine studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Nell stood still under the examination, her fingers laced quietly before her, her expression calm. She did not fidget. She did not drop her gaze. She met the dowager's scrutiny with the same quiet composure she met everything else. "Nell," the dowager repeated, as though weighing the name on her tongue and finding it light. "You carry yourself well for a housemaid. Where were you before Dunhallow?" "A small household in Whitby, Your Grace." "Well, Qui." The lie was practiced, seamless. "The family relocated abroad." Lady Jessamine's eyes, gray-green and startlingly sharp for a woman of her years, moved from Nell's face to her hands. The dowager's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a spark of something that might have been recognition or might have been curiosity. "Thank you, Nell. That will be all." Nell curtsied again and left. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Lady Jessamine set down her teacup and looked at her son. "Tell me about the horse." Soren stiffened. "There is nothing to tell, Soren. I have been in this house for 40 minutes, and I have already heard 3 separate accounts from 3 separate servants about a housemaid and Leander's stallion. The kitchen boy speaks of it as though it were a haunting. The groom is convinced it is witchcraft. And your housekeeper, whom I passed in the corridor, looked as though she had swallowed a wasp when I mentioned the girl's name. So I will ask again. Tell me about the horse," he told her. Briefly, reluctantly, with the clipped precision of a man reporting facts he wished were not facts. The horse's behavior, the girl's routine, the scene at the paddock fence, the rule he had authorized at Mrs. Selwick's urging. Lady Jessamine listened without interruption. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, turning her teaspoon slowly between her fingers. "And the girl," she said. "You watched her turn away from the animal." "I did." "She was not afraid of it." "No." "She wanted to touch it. You could see that." "Yes." "But she obeyed your rule instead. Even though it cost her, even though no one was watching, or so she believed." A pause. "Yes." Lady Jessamine nodded slowly. "And this rule? It was Mrs. Selwick's idea, I assume. She manages the household. It is her domain. Her domain, the dowager repeated, and there was an edge to her voice now. A blade wrapped in silk. Soren, I have known Constance Selwick for 15 years. She is a competent woman, but she is not a kind one. She manages this household the way a jailer manages a prison, through control and fear. And I have watched her, over the years, take a particular and unwarranted dislike to any servant who does not cower. Mother, that girl does not cower. Did you notice? She stood in this room and met my eyes without trembling. She answered my questions with intelligence and composure. Her hands are rough, but her bearing is not. And your housekeeper wants her gone. She leaned forward. Ask yourself why. Because the horse is dangerous, and the girl is a liability. The horse is grieving, Lady Jessamine said, her voice dropping, as are you. And that girl is the first living soul in 8 months that the animal has shown any warmth toward. That is not a liability, Soren. That is a gift. And instead of understanding it, you have written a rule to forbid it. She stood and walked to the mantelpiece, resting her hand on the cold marble. Her back was to him, but he could hear the emotion in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Your brother loved that horse, he said. Sovereign could read a person's soul. I thought it was Leander being. Leander all poetry and no sense. But I am beginning to wonder if perhaps the poet understood something the rest of us missed. She turned to face him. Grief needs to find its way somewhere, Soren. You have locked yours in this study, with your ledgers and your duty. You have locked that horse in a paddock with nothing but its own misery. And now you have forbidden the one person who might ease both of your sorrows from offering so much as a touch. Her eyes, so like his own, held him with a force that titles and authority could not match. Your father would not have done this. Leander certainly would not have. So, I must ask you, my son, whose voice are you listening to, your own or Mrs. Selwick's? Soren had no answer. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful sound of wind moving across the moors. His mother's words had struck something deep, a fault line in the granite of his composure that he had not known existed. That night, Soren could not sleep. He rose from his bed and dressed in the dark, pulling on a coat over his shirt, and walked the corridors of Dunhallow, the way he sometimes did when the house felt too large and his thoughts too small to fill it. The halls were vast at night, lit only by the occasional oil lamp left burning at the intersections, the shadows pooling in the corners like dark water. He walked without destination, his footsteps muffled by the thick runners, past the portrait gallery, past the armory, past the closed doors of Leander's rooms, which he had not entered since the funeral, and could not yet bring himself to open. He found himself in the east wing, near the music room. Leander's music room. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Mrs. Selwick kept all the unused rooms sealed. He stopped and listened. At first he thought it was the wind. The east wing was notorious for its drafts, the old casement windows letting in the North Sea gales that could sound almost human in their keening. But this was not the wind. This was music. It was faint, a single melodic line played on the pianoforte that had sat untouched since Leander's death. The notes were hesitant at first, tentative, as though the player were afraid of being heard. Then they gathered confidence, flowing into a passage of such delicate, aching beauty that Soren felt the breath leave his body. He knew the instrument. It was a Broadwood Grand, Leander's most treasured possession after the horse. No one had played it in 8 months. No one had been permitted to. Yet someone was playing it now, in the dead of night, and playing it with a skill that was not merely competent, but extraordinary. He moved toward the door. His hand touched the wood. He pushed it open. Slowly, silently. The music stopped. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. The faint scent of beeswax and dust and something else, something floral and out of place, hung in the still air. The piano lid was down, the bench was pushed neatly against the instrument, the room was empty. But the air still hummed with the ghost of the melody, and when Soren pressed his fingers to the piano's wooden case, the surface was warm. Someone had been here. Someone had played. And they had vanished like smoke the moment he touched the door. He stood in the dark music room for a long time, his hand resting on the piano, his heart doing something it had not done in months. It was beating faster. The music room became her obsession. In the days following Lady Jessamine's visit, something shifted in the atmosphere of Dunhallow. The Dowager's presence acted as a kind of shield, her sharp tongue and sharper eyes keeping Mrs. Selwick at a careful distance. The housekeeper still issued orders, still controlled the machinery of the household, but she did so with a restraint that was new, as though she were aware of being observed by someone whose opinion she could not dismiss. For Eloan, the reprieve was both a relief and a torment. It gave her space to breathe, but it also sharpened her awareness of how little time she might have. Lady Jessamine would leave. The shield would fall. Mrs. Selwick would resume her campaign with renewed fury, and the next rule, the next decree, might be the one that finally drove her from the house, for good. She had to act. The music room was in the east wing, 2 doors past the corridor of windows where Sovereign kept his vigil. Leander's Broadwood Grand sat in the center of the room like a sleeping animal, its ebony case gleaming dully in what little light filtered through the drawn curtains. Around it, the room held the accumulated treasures of 3 generations of Aldermere musicians, a glass-fronted cabinet of sheet music, a rack of instruments, a writing desk with a slanted surface designed for musical notation, and against the far wall, half hidden behind a folding screen painted with pastoral scenes, a tall oak bookcase filled with bound volumes of scores, some of them centuries old. Her father had spoken of this room, not often, and never with the reverence he reserved for the library or the gardens, but with a particular, careful specificity that she now recognized as instruction, disguised as reminiscence. He had described the bookcase. He had mentioned the volumes by period and origin. He had once said, in a way that had seemed offhand but now struck her as deliberately precise, that the old Duke kept his most personal items where the music lived, because music, unlike words, could keep a secret without telling a lie. She had not understood at the time. She understood now. The difficulty was access. The music room had been locked since Leander's death. Mrs. Selwick kept the keys on the heavy iron ring that hung from her belt like a symbol of office. The only times the room was opened were for cleaning, a task assigned on a strict rotation that had never once included Nell. But the night she had played the piano, she had discovered something. The lock on the music room door was old, a simple 2-lever mechanism that could be turned with a hairpin and patience. She had learned the skill from necessity during her years of destitution, when locked doors had sometimes been the only barrier between her and a dry place to sleep. It was not a skill she was proud of. It was a skill that might save her. She chose a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the assembly. Lady Jessamine had departed 2 days earlier, leaving behind a house that felt somehow larger and emptier for her absence. Mrs. Stecht. Selwick had reasserted her authority with immediate effect, doubling Nell's workload and reassigning her to the cellars for the week. The message was clear. The protection was gone. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Eloan waited until the house was asleep. She lay in her narrow bed, fully dressed beneath the blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of the household settling. The creak of floorboards as the last servants returned to their rooms, the distant clang of the kitchen clock striking 11, then 12, the groan of the old pipes as the fires died. At midnight she rose. She took no candle. The moon was nearly full, and its light, cold and blue-white, poured through the corridor windows with enough strength to guide her steps. She moved through the servants' quarters in her stockinged feet, her boots in one hand, her other hand trailing along the wall. The descent to the ground floor was the most dangerous stretch. The main staircase was impossible, too exposed, too central. She used the narrow service stairs at the east end of the house, the ones that spiraled down through the walls like a stone throat, emerging into the passage behind the still room. From there, she crossed the servants' hall, empty now and smelling of cold grease and extinguished candles, and slipped through the baize door into the family's wing. The east corridor stretched before her, moonlit and silent. She could see the tall windows on her left, and beyond them the dark shape of the paddock. Somewhere out there, Sovereign stood in the darkness, another sleepless creature in a house of insomniacs. She reached the music room door. Her hands were steady. She had rehearsed this in her mind 100 times, every step, every second, every contingency. She knelt and worked the lock with the hairpin. The mechanism resisted, then yielded with a soft click that sounded, in the absolute silence, like a pistol shot. She eased the door open and stepped inside. The moonlight was generous here. The east-facing windows admitted long rectangles of silver that fell across the floor and climbed the walls, illuminating the room in a pale, spectral glow. The piano gleamed. The glass cabinet glinted. The painted screen cast an elaborate shadow across the far wall. Elowen moved directly to the bookcase behind the screen. She could not afford hesitation. She ran her fingers along the spines of the bound volumes, reading titles by touch and by the faint light. Handel, Purcell. A collection of Tudor madrigals. A set of Bach partitas in a binding she recognized as German. Late 18th century. She was looking for something specific. Her father had described a particular volume, a large folio of English folk songs, bound in red Morocco leather, with the Aldermere crest stamped in gold on the spine. He had used it during his cataloging work. He had spent weeks with it, annotating and cross-referencing, and he had, she now believed, used it as a hiding place. The bookcase was tall, 7 shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling. She worked from the bottom, pulling volumes forward, checking behind them, running her palm along the back panel of each shelf. The work was agonizingly slow. Every sound she made, the whisper of leather on wood, the soft thump of a displaced volume, seemed amplified by the silence into something enormous and incriminating. The 3rd shelf. The 4th. Her fingers were growing cold. The moonlight was shifting, the rectangles on the floor narrowing as the moon moved westward. She was losing her light. The 5th shelf. She stretched on her toes, her arm extended to its full reach. Her fingers touched a spine that was thicker than the others, broader, bound in a material that was smoother and finer than the surrounding volumes. She gripped it and pulled. It would not come. It was wedged tight, pressed between 2 heavy German hymnals. She pulled harder, adjusting her angle, and felt it give. The volume slid free, and with it came a cascade of dust and something else. A folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age, that had been tucked between the folio and the back panel of the shelf. It fluttered to the floor like a moth with broken wings. Elowen's heart clenched. She knelt, her fingers trembling, and picked up the paper. She unfolded it in the moonlight. It was a letter. The handwriting was familiar, achingly so. The elegant, slightly irregular hand of her father. "My dearest Elowen," it began. "If you are reading this, then my fears have been justified, and you have had to come looking for what I should have given you myself." Tears blurred her vision. She pressed the letter to her chest, unable to read further, unable to breathe. He had known. He had anticipated the betrayal. He had left her a trail. She forced herself to read on. The letter was brief, written in haste. It spoke of a hidden compartment in the piano itself, beneath the soundboard, accessible through a panel in the instrument's base. Inside, he had placed the original deed to Larkspur Hollow, a signed letter of bequest in his own hand, predating the forged will by 3 years, and a small leather journal containing his personal account of the arrangement with Mr. Madian Selwick, including dates, conversations, and his growing suspicion that the man intended to cheat his daughter. The piano. The proof was inside the piano. Elowen rose from the floor, her father's letter clutched in her hand. She turned toward the broadwood. It sat in the center of the room, massive and dark and patient, holding it secret as it had held it for 2 years, while she scrubbed floors 10 feet above it and never knew. She took a step toward it. Then she heard the sound, a floorboard. Not in this room. In the corridor just outside the door she had left slightly ajar. A single deliberate creak, the unmistakable weight of a boot placed slowly and carefully on old wood. Someone was there. Eloan's body went rigid. She slipped behind the painted screen, pressing herself against the bookcase. The letter crushed against her ribs. Her breath came in shallow, silent gasps. She strained to listen. Silence. Had she imagined it? The house was old. It groaned and settled on its own, speaking in a language of wood and stone that had nothing to do with human occupation. Then the door swung open. No moonlight entered from the corridor, which meant whoever had opened the door was standing in the frame, blocking it. A tall figure, broad across the shoulders, utterly still. "I know you are here," said the Duke of Dunhallow. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost gentle. It was the gentleness that terrified her most, the calm of a man who had been waiting, who had expected this, who was in no hurry because the trap was already closed. "I have been listening for 3 nights. I was beginning to think I had imagined the music." Eloan did not move. She did not breathe. She heard him step into the room. His boots were soft on the carpet. He did not approach the screen. Instead, she heard the scrape of a match. A lamp flared to life on the writing desk, flooding the room with warm amber light that made the shadows behind the screen seem darker by contrast. "You may come out," he said, "or you may stay behind that screen until morning, and Mrs. Selwick can find you here when she comes to unlock the room at 7. The choice, I think, is simple." It was. Eloan closed her eyes, steadied herself, and stepped out from behind the screen. The Duke stood by the writing desk, one hand resting on the lamp. He was not in his evening clothes. He wore a loose shirt, open at the collar, and a dark coat thrown on without care. His black hair was uncombed, falling across his forehead. His face, sharp and angular in the lamplight, held an expression she had not seen before. It was not anger, it was not suspicion, it was a fierce, searching intensity. The look of a man trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. His eyes dropped to her hand, to the letter she was still clutching. "What is that?" he asked. Eloan looked down at the letter, at her father's handwriting visible between her white-knuckled fingers. She could lie. She could say she had found it on the floor, that she did not know what it was. But the lie felt impossible in this room, in this light, in the presence of her father's piano, and this man's unblinking gaze. "It is a letter," she said, "from my father." The words hung in the air between them. She saw his expression shift, a tremor of something moving behind the careful mask. Confusion, perhaps, or the first tremor of understanding. "Your father," he repeated slowly. "Yes. And your father's letters are kept in my music room, behind my brother's sheet music, in a house where you have worked as a housemaid for 4 months. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not unravel everything. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the evidence of months of sleepless grief etched into his skin. "The music I heard," he said, "last week and the week before. The piano. That was you. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. Yes. You play like a professional, like someone who has trained for years. I have. Housemaids do not train in pianoforte for years." "No," she said. "They do not." The silence that followed was immense. She could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, counting out the seconds of her unraveling. The Duke's gaze moved from her face to the piano, then back again. She saw him assembling the pieces, turning them over, testing their fit. A maid who played like a concert musician. A letter from a father hidden in a music room. The horse that had chosen her. The composure that no amount of scrubbing and servitude could erode. "Who are you?" he asked. And like the question his mother had posed over tea, it was not a question addressed to a servant. It was a question addressed to a mystery. Aloan felt the truth pressing against her teeth like a living thing. Her name, her real name, the name her father had given her, the name that had been stripped away and buried under 2 years of poverty and false identities and silent, burning rage. It wanted out. It demanded air. But she could not yet. The letter in her hand spoke of documents hidden inside the piano, but she had not reached them. If she revealed herself now before she had the proof, it would be her word against a forged will and a dead man's silence. She would have nothing. "I am no one of consequence, Your Grace," she said. Her voice did not waver. "I am a servant who should not be in this room. I accept whatever judgment you see fit." His jaw tightened. She saw frustration cross his face, the expression of a man who had been offered a locked door when he had expected it to open. "You are lying," he said quietly. "And you are very good at it. But you are not good enough." He held out his hand. "Give me the letter." Her fingers tightened on the paper. This was her father's last message to her. The only proof that he had loved her, had thought of her, had tried to protect her. To surrender. It felt like surrendering him. "Please," she whispered. It was the first time she had asked anything of anyone in this house. Something moved in his face. A crack in the granite. He lowered his hand. "Keep it," he said, his voice rough. "Go back to your room. We will speak of this tomorrow." She did not wait to be told twice. She moved past him, close enough to catch the scent of ink and night air, and something warmer underneath. And she walked out of the music room, with her father's letter held against her heart like a talisman. Behind her, the Duke stood alone in the lamplight, surrounded by his dead brother's music, and stared at the piano as though seeing it for the first time. The following morning, before the staff had finished their breakfast porridge, Mrs. Selwick requested an audience with the Duke. Soren received her in the study. He had not slept. The events of the night had left him in a state of restless, electric alertness, his mind turning over the same questions in an endless, tightening spiral. Who was she? What was the letter? Why the piano? He had spent the remaining hours of darkness sitting in the music room, running his hands over the instrument's case, thinking of Leander, thinking of the girl, thinking of the strange and terrible way that grief could connect two people who had no business being connected. Mrs. Selwick entered with the bearing of a woman who has prepared her case with prosecutorial thoroughness. Her face was composed, her posture rigid as a sentinel's, her voice measured and precise. "Your Grace, I must bring a serious matter to your attention. I have reason to believe the maid, Nell, has been entering restricted areas of the house during the night. I discovered the music room door unlocked this morning. The lock has been tampered with." Soren watched her from behind his desk. His face gave nothing away. "Go on," he said. "I also have it on good authority from Agnes, the scullery maid, that Nell was seen leaving her room well after midnight on at least 2 occasions in the past fortnight. Her behavior has been consistently irregular since her arrival. She is secretive, she is defiant, and I believe she poses a risk to the security of this household." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she delivered her conclusion with the quiet satisfaction of a surgeon making a final incision. "I recommend immediate dismissal, Your Grace. I have prepared the papers. They require only your signature." She produced a folded document from her apron pocket and placed it on the desk. Soren looked at it but did not touch it. The paper sat between them like a line drawn on a battlefield. He thought of the girl in the music room, her steady voice, her refusal to answer his questions, the letter she had clutched with white-knuckled desperation. He thought of his mother's words, "Ask yourself why." But he also thought of the tampered lock, the midnight excursions, the secrets. Whatever the girl's reasons, she had broken into a room in his house in the dead of night. She had lied to him about her identity. She was hiding something, and for all his growing sympathy, for all the horse's strange devotion, and his mother's instincts, He could not ignore the fact that he did not know what it was. He was the Duke of Dunhallow. He had a duty to his household, to order, to the trust that his staff placed in his judgment, and Mrs. Selwick, for all her severity, had served this family for 15 years without a single proven falsehood. The girl had been in his house since midsummer. She had lied about who she was. He was certain of that now. "Very well," he said. The words tasted like ash. "Send her in." Nell arrived within minutes. She stood before his desk in her gray uniform, her hands clasped at her waist, her face composed in the expression he had come to recognize as her armor, a stillness so complete it could be mistaken for emptiness. But he knew better now. He had seen behind it, in the music room, in the moonlight. He knew the stillness was not empty, it was full to breaking. Mrs. Selwick stood to one side, her presence a silent declaration of victory. Soren picked up the papers. He did not look at the housekeeper, he looked at the girl. "These are papers of dismissal," he said, "effective immediately. You will forfeit your remaining wages as compensation for the damage to the music room lock. You will vacate the premises before sunset." He paused. The next words were the hardest he had ever spoken, harder than the eulogy at Leander's funeral, harder than the cold commands he had given to seal up his brother's rooms. "Sign them." He held out the papers and a pen. She took both. She did not read the papers immediately. She looked at him first, and in that look he saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was not even disappointment. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had expected this, who had prepared for this, who had known from the beginning that the world worked this way and had come anyway, hoping against all evidence that this time, this place, this man might be different. She looked down. She read the papers slowly, carefully, as though they were a document of some importance rather than the death warrant of her last hope. Then she did something that no servant in the history of Dunhallow Hall had ever done. She set down the pen. She folded the papers, neatly, precisely, with the same care she applied to the linens she had spent 4 months pressing and storing. She placed them on the edge of his desk, and she looked up at him. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "For 4 months of employment, I wish you and your household well." She curtsied. She turned. She walked out of the study without haste, without tears, without a single backward glance. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Mrs. Selwick exhaled a small, satisfied sound. "It is for the best, Your Grace. The household will be better for it." Soren did not hear her. He was staring at the folded papers on the edge of his desk. She had not signed them. She had folded them and set them down and thanked him and left. She had refused to put her name to her own destruction. And she had not taken the pen. The realization struck him like a physical blow. She had not argued. She had not wept. She had not begged for mercy or protested her innocence. She had simply refused, with a dignity so absolute that it made the room feel smaller and his title feel lighter, and the woman standing beside him feel like exactly what she was. An architect of ruin. "Leave me," he said to Mrs. Selwick. His voice was barely audible. "Your Grace, leave me. Now." The housekeeper departed. Soren sat alone in his study, the unsigned papers before him, and felt the foundations of his certainty crack and begin to give way. He had done something wrong. He had done something terribly, profoundly wrong, and she was packing her things. He rose from his desk and went to the window. 20 minutes later, he saw her. A small figure in a dark traveling cloak, carrying a single worn bag, walking down the long gravel drive toward the gate. She did not look back at the house. She did not pause. The autumn wind pulled at her cloak and her hair, and she leaned into it as though it were an old adversary she had long since learned to endure. From the east paddock, a sound rose into the afternoon air. Sovereign had come to the fence. The stallion stood pressed against the rails, his neck stretched over the top bar, his dark eyes following the receding figure, As she passed beyond his sight line, he began to scream. Not a whinny, not a call. A raw, ragged, tearing sound that split the quiet of the estate like a blade, and did not stop. Soren gripped the windowsill until his knuckles went white. The sun was still above the tree line. She had left before sunset, exactly as the papers had stipulated. She had obeyed his final order with the same terrible, perfect dignity with which she had obeyed every order before it. And it destroyed him. He did not move from the window until the gravel drive was empty and the light had gone from gold to gray. Sovereign's cries had subsided into a low, rhythmic keening that carried across the paddock like the sound of something ancient and irreparable breaking apart. Soren returned to his desk. He sat. He stared at the folded papers. He picked them up and opened them. Her name was not on them. The line where her signature should have been was blank, a white space that accused him more eloquently than any words. He thought of her face in the study. That look. Not anger. Recognition. She had known he would fail her. She had come to this house expecting exactly this, and she had come anyway. Why? The question drove him from the study and back to the music room. He went directly to the bookcase behind the screen. He could see where she had been. Several volumes on the fifth shelf were slightly displaced, a gap in the row where a large folio had been pulled forward. He reached for it. The red Morocco leather, the Aldermere crest in gold, the volume of English folk songs his father had kept for decades. He pulled it out and examined the space behind it. Nothing. Whatever she had found, she had taken with her. But the letter. She had said it was from her father, a father whose letters were hidden behind sheet music in the Duke of Dunhallow's private collection. A father who had some connection to this room, this house, this family. He set the folio on the writing desk and opened it. The pages were filled with musical notation, some printed, some handwritten. In the margins, annotations in a hand he did not recognize. Detailed, scholarly, precise. Cross-references to other works. Historical notes on the origins of each melody. The work of a serious musicologist. At the front of the volume on the fly-leaf, a name was inscribed in faded ink. Property of Callum Thorne, with the compliments of His Grace the Duke of Dunhallow. Callum Thorne. The name meant nothing to him. But it would. He went to his father's study, a room he rarely entered, and began to search. His father had been a meticulous record keeper. Ledgers of correspondence, filed by year and by name. Soren pulled the volumes from the shelf and worked through them with a focus that bordered on ferocity. He found the first letter within the hour, dated 12 years ago. A warm collegial note from Callum Thorne thanking the Duke for his hospitality and for access to the Aldermere music collection. It spoke of their shared passion for preserving England's musical heritage. It mentioned a daughter, a bright child, uncommonly gifted. She plays already with a maturity that astonishes her teachers. More letters followed. A correspondence spanning nearly a decade. Thorne's visits to Dunhallow. His work cataloging the collection. His growing friendship with the old Duke. And then, in the final letters, a change in tone, anxiety, urgency. A letter dated just months before Callum Thorne's death. My Lord Duke, I must confide in you a matter of grave personal concern. My wife's cousin, a man named Selwick, has taken an unhealthy interest in my estate and my work. I have reason to believe he intends to act against my daughter's interests should anything befall me. I have therefore taken the liberty of concealing certain documents within your music room, in a location I have described to Alowan in a separate letter. I trust your Grace's honor absolutely. Should the worst come to pass, I beg you to ensure these documents reach my daughter. She is all I have in this world, and this world has not been kind enough to deserve her. Soren read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred and reformed and blurred again. Elowen. Her name was Elowen. He set the letter down and pressed his palms flat against the desk, steadying himself against the weight of what he now understood. She was Callum Thorne's daughter, a gentleman's daughter, a scholar's child, raised in music and learning and love, a woman who had been robbed of everything by a man named Selwick. And she had come here, to this house, to the very household run by that man's sister, and she had scrubbed floors and endured cruelties and kept her silence for months on end, searching for the proof her father had hidden. And he had handed her dismissal papers and told her to leave before sunset. The rage that filled him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was not hot. It was cold, a deep, glacial fury directed inward at his own blindness, his own arrogance, his own catastrophic failure to see what was standing directly in front of him. He went back to the music room. He knelt beside the piano. His father's letter had mentioned documents concealed in the room. Her father's letter, which she had taken with her, presumably contained the specific location, but Soren was methodical, as his mother liked to remind him. He examined the base of the Broadwood, running his hands along the panels. It took him 20 minutes to find it, a section of the base panel, beautifully fitted, that moved when pressed at the correct angle. It slid aside to reveal a shallow cavity, and inside, wrapped in oilskin, a leather portfolio. He carried it to the desk and opened it, with hands that were not steady. Inside, he found a deed of title for a property called Larkspur Hollow in Somerset, naming Eloan Callista Thorne as sole beneficiary. A signed letter of bequest in Callum Thorne's hand, dated 3 years before his death, leaving all possessions, including his manuscripts and their proceeds, to his daughter. And a journal, small and densely written, documenting every conversation, every suspicion, every piece of evidence that Callum Thorne had gathered against the man he feared would destroy his child's future. The man whose sister was, at this moment, somewhere in Dunhallow Hall, believing she had won. Soren closed the portfolio. He stood. He rang the bell. The footman appeared, within a minute, breathless. "Saddle Dorian," the Duke said, naming the bay gelding he used for estate business. "And then find Mrs. Selwick. Tell her I require her presence in the music room in 1 hour. She is not to leave the house. And your Grace's destination?" Soren was already pulling on his riding coat. "The village, the coaching inn, she cannot have gotten far." He was in the stable yard before the footman could reply, but it was not Dorian waiting for him. Sovereign stood at the open door of his stall, already bridled by a bewildered coach, who held the lead rope at arm's length, and stared at the Duke as though the world had lost its reason. "He walked out on his own, Your Grace," the groom said, calm as Sunday. "I've never seen him like this." The stallion stood motionless as Soren mounted. He did not kick, he did not rear. He simply turned toward the gate, his ears forward, his great body vibrating with a single urgent purpose, as though the animal understood exactly where they were going and why. He found her at the Hare and Lantern, the coaching inn at the crossroads 2 miles from the estate. She was sitting on a wooden bench in the yard, her bag at her feet, waiting for the evening coach to York. The wind had pulled strands of dark hair from beneath her bonnet, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her posture was the same as it had always been, upright, composed, unbroken. Sovereign, lathered from the hard ride, stamped and blew as Soren dismounted. The stallion's ears pricked forward. He had caught her scent. Eloan looked up. For a moment, her composure faltered. Something raw and unguarded flashed across her face, surprise. Then a flicker of hope so brief it might have been imagined. And then the mask was back, smooth and impenetrable. "Your Grace," she said. She did not stand. She did not curtsy. She was no longer his servant. "Miss Thorne," he said. The name struck her like a bell. She went very still. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes, gray-green in the fading light, searched his face with an intensity that was almost painful. "Yes," he said, answering the question she had not asked. "I know." He reached into his coat and withdrew the leather portfolio. He held it out to her. "Your father left these in my family's care. My father failed to deliver them. I have compounded that failure in ways I will spend the rest of my life regretting. But they are yours. They were always yours." Her hands trembled as she took the portfolio. She opened it. She saw the deed. She saw the letter of bequest in her father's handwriting. She saw the journal. And the composure that had survived 2 years of destitution, 4 months of servitude, a campaign of persecution, and a dismissal delivered by the one man she had allowed herself to trust, finally irreversibly broke. She wept. Not quietly, not decorously, not with the restrained tears of a woman maintaining appearances. She wept with the full, shuddering force of a grief that had been held underwater for so long it had forgotten what air tasted like. She pressed her father's letter of bequest against her face and cried into his handwriting, and the sound of it was the most devastating thing Soren Aldermere had ever heard. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He stood beside the horse in the inn yard and let her grieve, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some pain was too sacred to interrupt. When the tears subsided, she looked up at him. Her face was ruined, blotched, and swollen, and she had never looked less like a housemaid or more like herself. "Will you come back?" he asked. His voice was rough. "Not as a servant. Never again as a servant. Will you come back so that I can make this right?" She looked at the portfolio in her hands. She looked at the coaching inn, the road to York, the world beyond the estate that had offered her nothing but cruelty for 2 years. Then she looked at him, and at the black horse standing behind him, who had turned his great head toward her and was breathing in long, gentle gusts, as though the mere proximity of her was enough to calm the tempest inside him. "Yes," she said. They returned to Dunhallow together. Iloan rode sovereign. It happened without discussion, without ceremony. She had walked to the horse, and the horse had lowered his head, and she had placed her hand on his neck, and the animal had gone utterly still beneath her touch. When Soren offered her the stirrup, she mounted with a natural grace that spoke of years of riding, and Sovereign carried her up the long drive to the house as though he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this. The staff, alerted by the footman, watched from the windows. Nell, the housemaid, was returning on the Duke's own horse. The whispers would fuel the household for months. Mrs. Selwick was waiting in the music room as instructed. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped at her waist, her face a rigid mask, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted from the Duke to the girl beside him, and in them was the first flicker of something the housekeeper had never before permitted herself to feel: fear. Elowen entered the room with the leather portfolio in her hands and the Duke at her side. Behind them, uninvited but unmistakable, the heavy tread of Sovereign's hooves sounded on the flagstones of the corridor. The stallion had followed them into the house. No one attempted to stop him. The Duke did not sit. He did not offer pleasantries. He walked to the writing desk and placed Callum Thorne's final letter on its surface, facing the housekeeper. "Read it," he said. Mrs. Selwick's eyes moved across the letter. With each line, something drained from her face: color, certainty, the architecture of control she had spent 15 years constructing. By the time she reached the signature, her hands were shaking. "Your brother stole this woman's inheritance," Soren said. His voice was quiet, and in its quietness there was something far more frightening than any shout. "He forged a will. He bribed a solicitor. He sold her father's life's work and cast her into the street with nothing. And you knew." "I did not." "You knew," he repeated, and the word was a door closing. "You received his letters. You facilitated his scheme. And when his victim walked into this house seeking justice, you recognized the threat she posed, and you set about destroying her. You isolated her. You persecuted her. You lied to me about her character. And when that was not enough, you engineered her dismissal, and I, to my eternal shame, allowed it." He turned to Iloan. In his face was the expression she had seen once before in the music room, in the lamplight. But it was deeper now, stripped of its guardedness, laid open in a way that made her chest ache. "Miss Thorne," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like an apology and a promise at the same time. "I owe you a debt that these documents alone cannot repay. My family was entrusted with your future, and we failed you. I failed you. I ask your forgiveness, though I have no right to it." Eloan looked at him, then she looked at Mrs. Selwick, the woman who had portioned her meals and halved her candles and assigned her the coldest rooms in the house. The woman whose brother had sold her father's manuscripts before the grave was settled. She expected to feel rage. She had carried it for so long, a black stone lodged beneath her breastbone, heavy and permanent. All locks. But looking at the housekeeper now, at the trembling hands and the ashen face and the crumbling edifice of a life built on control and complicity, Eloan felt the stone dissolve. What replaced it was not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was something close to release. "What will happen to her?" she asked quietly. Soren looked at Mrs. Selwick. The housekeeper did not meet his eyes. She was staring at the floor, her rigid posture finally irrevocably broken. "You will leave Dunhallow," he said. "A position will be found for you in a household far from here. You will have a reference that reflects your years of service, but nothing more. You will have no contact with your brother regarding Miss Thorne or her affairs, and you will understand that this mercy is not mine. It is hers." He looked at Eloan as he said it, and she understood. He had given her the choice without asking the question. He had made justice an act of her character, not his authority. Mrs. Selwick let out a breath that seemed to empty her of everything she had ever held. She nodded once, a jerky mechanical movement, and walked to the door. She paused at the threshold, and for a moment Eloan thought she might speak, might offer some word of explanation or remorse. But the housekeeper simply looked at her, a long, unreadable gaze, and then she was gone. In the silence that followed, Sovereign pushed his way through the doorway, his massive frame barely fitting through the opening. He crossed the room and came to stand beside Eloan, pressing his warm flank against her side. She rested her hand on his neck, and the horse let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry with it the last of his grief. Soren looked at the woman and the horse standing together in his brother's music room, surrounded by his brother's music, illuminated by the last light of a day that had begun with injustice and was ending with something that felt, for the first time in months, like grace. "Welcome home, Miss Thorne," he said, and this time she believed him. Spring came to Dunhallow like a guest who had been turned away too many times and had finally been invited in. The moors, beyond the estate, softened from iron gray to 1,000 shades of green. The hedgerows erupted in white blossoms. The sea, visible from the upper windows, lost its winter fury and lay against the cliffs in long, easy swells of blue and silver. Even the house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though the stone walls had released a held breath that had lasted the better part of a year. Eloan was no longer a maid. She was the estate's music curator, a title that Soren had invented specifically for her and that she suspected did not exist anywhere else in England. Her role was to restore, catalog, and preserve the Aldermere music collection, a task that could occupy a scholar for years, and that gave her a place in the household that was neither servant nor family, but something entirely her own. She had moved into the guest suite in the east wing, the rooms with the windows that overlooked the paddock. Each morning she woke to the sound of Sovereign's hooves on the packed earth below, and each morning she went to the window, and the horse raised his head and stood still, as though her appearance were a kind of sunrise he had been waiting for. The Broadwood Grand was open again. Its voice filled the east wing in the afternoons, carrying through the corridors and drifting out through the open windows into the garden. The staff, who had once whispered about the ghost that haunted the music room, now paused in their work to listen. It was Leander's piano, but the music was new and it was alive, and it changed the texture of the house the way light changes the texture of a room when someone finally draws the curtains. Soren heard it from his study, from the garden, from the stables where he had begun spending time with Sovereign. The bond that had formed in a single desperate ride to a coaching inn had deepened into something quieter and steadier. The horse no longer merely tolerated him. It allowed his hand on its neck, his voice in its ear. It did not love him the way it loved Eloan, with that absolute unwavering devotion. But it accepted him, and that, he understood, was Sovereign's way of honoring the resemblance between the two brothers, the one he had lost and the one who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to remain. The household had settled into a new rhythm. The new housekeeper, Mrs. Lennox, was a warm, practical woman from the village whom Eloan had suggested and Soren had hired without hesitation. She ran the house with firm kindness rather than rigid control, and the difference was immediate. The staff smiled. The fires were lit earlier. The corridors lost their chill. Lady Jessamine visited more frequently now. She and Eloan spent long afternoons together in the drawing room, talking about music and books and the particular challenge of loving difficult men. The dowager had taken to calling Eloan my dear girl, and there was in the phrase a weight of affection and approval that needed no elaboration. Eloan's solicitors, engaged by Soren at his own expense, had begun proceedings against Mr. Ower. Selwick. The journal her father had left was devastating evidence. The forged will was being challenged. Larkspur Hollow was being reclaimed. The process was slow, as justice often is, but it was moving. And for the first time in 2 years, the future felt like something that belonged to her. But what surprised her most was not the restoration of her property or her name. It was the restoration of something she had thought permanently lost: joy. It happened on an evening in late May, the kind of evening that the English countryside produces perhaps 5 times a year, when the light turns gold and the air is warm and still, and the world seems to hold its breath in recognition of its own beauty. Eloan was in the music room playing, not one of her father's compositions and not one of the old folk melodies she was cataloguing, but something new, something she had been writing in the quiet hours of the morning, a piece that had come to her slowly over weeks, the way important things always came to her, not in a rush of inspiration, but in a patient accumulation of small, true notes. She did not hear him enter. She was aware of him only when the music ended, and the silence that followed was not empty, but inhabited. She turned on the bench and found him standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, watching her with an expression that was no longer guarded, no longer searching, no longer afraid of what it might reveal. "That is new," he said. "It is. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." She smiled. He had begun to say things like this, quietly, without ceremony, dropping them into conversation, like stones into still water, watching the ripples with a kind of careful wonder. "Walk with me," he said. "The light is perfect." They walked through the garden and down to the cliff path, the route that followed the headland above the sea. Sovereign trailed behind them at a distance, grazing the cliff-top grass, his black coat burnished copper in the low sun. The sea below was a sheet of hammered gold. They walked in silence for a time, the comfortable silence of two people who had learned that words were not always the most honest form of communication. "The solicitors believe the settlement will be finalized by autumn," he said. "The cottage, and the proceeds from the manuscripts. You will be independent, Eloan, truly independent. You will have no need of this house or this position or—" He stopped. The sentence had taken him somewhere he had not planned to go, and the unfinished thought hung between them like a held breath. "Or," she said. He turned to face her. The setting sun was behind him, and his face was in shadow, but she could see his eyes, and in them was something she had first glimpsed in the music room on a dark night when he had chosen curiosity over condemnation, and had been choosing in one way or another every day since. "I am not a man of easy words," he said. Leander had the words. I have the silences, but my silences have been saying something for months now, and I think you have heard them. I have, she said softly. Then you know what I'm about to ask. I do. But I would like to hear you ask it. The faintest smile crossed his face, the expression that had once been rare and severe, and was now in her presence becoming something warmer and more frequent. I'm asking you to stay, not as my curator, not as my guest, as the Duchess of Dunhallow, as the person who brought music back into this house and taught a grieving man that silence is not the same thing as peace. Eowyn looked at him. She looked at the great house on the cliff behind them, the house she had entered as a thief and a liar, and a desperate, grief-stricken girl with nothing but a borrowed name and a dead man's hope. She looked at Sovereign, standing on the headland with his mane lifting in the sea breeze, no longer a monument to sorrow, but a living, breathing testament to the stubborn persistence of love. Soren, she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name. I did not come to this house looking for you. I came looking for a piece of paper. But what I found was something no document could ever prove, and no forger could ever take away. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. Yes, she said, I will stay. He did not kiss her then. It was not quite his way. Not yet. Instead, he held her hand and they stood together on the cliff's edge, watching the sun sink into the sea, turning the water from gold to rose to a deep, luminous violet. Behind them, the windows of Dunhallow Hall caught the last light and blazed like a crown of fire. And from the paddock below the east wing, from the stable, where a black horse stood with his head raised to the evening wind, there came a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, a long, clear note, resonant and full, the sound of an animal calling not in grief, but in recognition, as though something lost had finally, after a long and patient search, been found.